Hey, before we get started with the show, we want to let you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is sponsored by Audible.com.
That's right. They have more than 180,000 audiobooks and spoken word audio products. They're the leading audiobook publishers, and you can choose such comics-related titles as Sean Howe's Marvel Comics, The Untold Story, and David Haydu's The 10-Cent Plague.
Get a free audiobook of your choice at www.audibletrial.com/comicsalternative. That's audibletrial.com/comicsalternative and get started today. This is the Comics Alternative Webcomics, reviews of The Secret Voice, Titan, and Black is the Color.
Countdown for blast off. X-5, 4, 3, 2, X-1, fire.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about webcomics.
And on this episode of the monthly webcomic series, we're going to be looking at 3 titles, 2 current and ongoing, and 1 already completed, all published by Study Group. First, we're going to look at Zack Soto's The Secret Voice. After that, Titan from François Vigneault. And then finally, we're going to look at Gfrörer's Black is the Color. But before we get to those discussions, we want to let all of our listeners know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics is brought to you by the good folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you'll find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off cover price, and every single month you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials are at 45% off cover price. Sometimes it's at 50% off cover price, but often the discounts become more impressive than that.
And you know, Derek, we usually talk at this point about the bundles that we have on DCB Service, but a lot of people may not know that they have a digital aspect too. If you go to the DCB Service website, if you look along the top of the page, over on the right-hand side, you'll see a little green arrow called My Digital Comics. And if you click on that, you're going to see all kinds of stuff. You're going to see new releases, hottest titles, free products. There are 30 pages of free products.
Wow.
And publishers. Now, a lot of the publishers you know about, publishers like Image Shadowline, Valiant, Top Cow, Action Lab, Dynamite, Boom Studios. Those are just some of the publishers that you'll see there, but you'll see tons of others.
Yeah, they have a lot there on their digital webcomics, My Digital Webcomics site. So make sure that you check it out. But whether it's mydigitalcomics.com or dcbservice.com, you got to go there for all of your comics needs, digital and otherwise. And after you do get your comics there, be sure to send those guys an email and let them know that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Yep.
So, Andy, this is an interesting episode, or I guess a notable episode of the monthly webcomic series for a couple of reasons. First, this is the first time that we're looking at 3 webcomics by the same publisher. And the publisher is Study Group Comics. As I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to look at The Secret Voice and Titan. Those are current and ongoing. But then we're also going to look at another Study Group title, and that is Black is the Color. And I guess this came about because we decided to do The Secret Voice and Titan, and they were both Study Group comics. You know, I found one, and you found one. and then we discovered the other. So, hey, why don't we go ahead and go with both of those for the current ongoing? But then we learned that Black is the Color, which was completed a few years ago, maybe 3 years ago. And thought, okay, it's a study group comic. Let's make it a study group episode.
Yeah, it's kind of like a little mini publisher spotlight for study group, and I think that's really cool. Like you said, Derek, it wasn't anything that we really planned. Hey, let's do a study group, spotlight, but it just worked out that way.
Yeah, and another reason why this is a very notable and a special episode of our monthly webcomic series is, at least for now, this is going to be the last show that you're on.
That's right. And, it's when we started this, what month was it we started this?
December.
Back in? Wow, it's December. I thought this would be a fun thing to do, and it is a fun thing to do. And I have learned so much about webcomics, and I was very apprehensive to get started because I thought, probably every listener to the podcast knows more about webcomics than I do. But it's really been a great education as far as what is out there and what webcomics can do. And I know we talked a lot about that in the very first episode, but webcomics are so diverse, so far reaching, and I feel like we've really just scratched the surface.
We have, and we'll continue to scratch the webcomic surface on the Comics Alternative, because even though this is your last episode, we're still going to be doing these. Now, stepping into your shoes is going to be Sean Kleefeld. He knows a lot about webcomics, and when you told me about your reasons for wanting to take a break or at least step aside from the webcomic show, which I'll refer to in a minute, I immediately thought of Sean and asked him if he's interested. He is. And beginning in August, he will be the new co-host of the webcomic show.
Yeah, and I know he'll do a great job. I've looked at his blog, and he's obviously very knowledgeable about comics and webcomics both. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say about webcomics starting in August.
Yeah. Now, I don't want to give too much away because we haven't solidified anything yet, but we should tell listeners that you're not going away. You're still going to be filling in on regular Comics Alternative episodes, but you may also be back in the not-too-distant future. Who knows how long of a future into the future it will be, with another show. And again, we don't want to give anything away because we're still in, I guess you could say, we're still in negotiation right now.
Right.
But if that comes through, you had decided to invest your time with this new project and not with the webcomics series, which makes sense. So listeners, even though Andy Wolverton is going to be leaving the webcomic show, keep listening to the Comics Alternative shows, and you will find out, I hope shortly, about a new series he may be a part of.
Yeah, and I know we can't say a lot about it, but it's something I'm very excited about, and something I've kind of wanted to be a part of for a long time. And I'm really hoping that this pans out. I will definitely miss doing the webcomics episodes, but this new project, if it pans out, I'm going to be very excited about that as well.
Yeah, so stay tuned for that. Okay, so Andy, are you ready to get into the comics for this month?
Yes, let's talk about them.
Now, the first one we're going to be discussing is Zack Soto's The Secret Voice. And this one, again, all of these comics, as we mentioned a moment ago, you can find at Study Group Comics. So if you go to the website, Study Group Comics, that's one word, studygroupcomics.com, and if you click on their webcomics link, you will easily and quickly find links to both The Secret Voice and Titan, because those are just two of the several currently ongoing comics that they have right now. So Secret Voice is the first one, and this one began back in 2012, and from what I can gather, the way that the website is set up, there are dates to each of the parts of the various webcomics, in this case, The Secret Voice. And right now we have 5 completed parts. I guess you could call them chapters or webcomic chapters. And the first one has the date of March 31st, 2012. So from what I've gathered, that first chapter was completed, or at least last updated, on March 31st of 2012. And then part 5 has the date of April 26th, 2015. So it hadn't been that long since part 5 went up. So you have 5 complete parts of this story, and there's still a lot more to come.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And Derek, one of the things that you and I were talking about before we hit the mic, listeners that go to follow The Secret Voice might be a little confused, because initially it says updates to the site are announced or it's updated every Sunday, and then later on after part 4 it says updated every Thursday. After part 5 it says updated most Mondays. So the thing is, you really just want to start reading it and read everything that's on there and just check back for the updates. And I know we're going to get into more details, but this is a really enjoyable webcomic that you're going to want to follow.
Exactly. So if you were going to explain or describe this title to someone who is into webcomics, but they wanted to get a sense of what this is about, how would you describe it to them?
Oh boy. Well, I'm going to wimp out and go with what they have on the website, which is very short. And it says, the warrior monk Dr. Galapagos races against time to stop a massive war, save himself, his world, and everyone he holds dear. That's kind of a capsulated version of what goes on, but there's so much more to it than that. I would say that The Secret Voice is part superhero, part quest story, part just gonzo action science fiction story. It's got a little bit of everything, and it's also a Western. So there's a little bit of everything in it, but it starts really in a really strange way, where we're getting this account of something, the end of something called the War of Compulsion, and it actually gives us these really weird dates taken from the official accountings of His Holiness Dr. Isaac Galapagos, and
who is our protagonist.
And he's narrating this journey that he's taking basically through the underworld, and he's going into these tunnels to meet the king of the cave trolls. And what he's trying to do is trying to warn them about this evil guy called Wu Hing, who's later called the Smog Emperor, who's basically enslaved a lot of the local population, and he's basically just taking over everything. And Dr. Galapagos is there to warn the trolls that, look, this guy's coming. I just wanted to warn you, and bad things are on the way, but you need to be warned. And then from there, I mean, basically just all hell breaks loose. I mean, we don't want to get too much into spoiler territory, but there's a lot of action, there's a lot of humor, there's a lot of violence, and Derek, this is just a fun webcomic.
Yeah, exactly. And I like the way that you described it, because you used a lot of genres, or I guess a mashup of genres, to try to describe what this is about. You said, to a point, this is kind of a superhero figure or a comic, because Dr. Galapagos is like a superhero. He wears a cape, a hooded cape. He also wears bandages around his head and special glasses. Now, we don't learn it, at least by the end of the 5th part, but I got the sense that the way that he's outfitted, especially with the glasses and maybe the bandages around his head, it may have something to do with a former battle that he was in with the Smog Emperor, in his forces, because someone comments at one point that people who basically no one survives because of the kind of weapons that they use, and Galapagos makes some kind of comment to the effect of, I was able to get at least somewhat better, but the remedy and the anecdote to, the poison that I was subjected to is kind of worse than the poison itself. Mm-hmm. And there's something that, even in this first part, the very first chapter, I guess you could call it, in The Secret Voice, there's something wrong with him, something going on with him. It probably is psychological, and the reason I say probably psychological, because toward the beginning of the first part, he makes reference to being released from psychic surgeons. Toward the beginning, he said, "And so a mere fortnight after being released from the care of the psychic surgeons of the Red College," which is the group, the organization, the army, the nation, I don't know, how do you describe the Red College, "I find myself in the dank and sweltering tunnels of the cave trolls." So I'm not going to suggest. I'm not necessarily suggesting that he's crazy or there's something wrong with his head, but we do know that he just recently got out of the care of the psychic surgeons, whoever these guys are. And then by the end of this first part, there is something that goes wrong with him, and we know that it's ongoing because he says something to the effect of, "Oh no, not again." Mm-hmm. And he looks like he's dizzy, and the way that Soto represents his frame of mind is by the visuals that surround Galapagos. It's a little blurry. Lines are overlapping. It's not near as clear. So the outward appearance of the comic panels themselves represent probably what's going on inside of Galapagos' head, which is quite a bit of chaos and confusion. And he ends up doing some stuff that he comes to regret.
But it's hilarious.
Yes, but again, it is hilarious. And but getting back to what is wrong with him and what he suffered in a former battle, we don't know exactly yet. I'm assuming that we'll find out in a future installment. But just know that there's something off about him, but he's still a very powerful and effective fighter.
Yes, and some of the mysteries surrounding Dr. Galapagos gets addressed as we go on in subsequent parts. We don't know everything yet. Information is revealed little by little, but it's not one of those, and we've talked, Derek, about these types of webcomics and graphic novels and comics that, they have so many things that are withheld that it gets to be kind of burdensome. Or we get kind of frustrated with the amount of knowledge that we aren't being told. This is not like that at all. And I think one of the things that makes this such a fun comic is we do have that element of mystery, but there's so much action and humor involved in it that we never really get weighted down with what we don't know.
Exactly. Now, I don't think this is any kind of spoiler because this takes place at the very end of Part 1, and as you mentioned, it is humorous. What happens when Galapagos goes, confused or dizzy or has some kind of spell of some sort, is he ends up cutting off the hand of the troll ruler, Thorgmal. And then he starts carrying the hand around, and then later he uses it in very interesting ways. I point this out not to just tell readers what to expect to happen event-wise in this first part, but to get back to what you mentioned earlier, the humor of this story. Because, this is one of the earliest instances of Soto's sense of humor. But there are other instances of this as well. For instance, later on, I think it's in Part 3, we're introduced to a bird by the name of Dalit. Mm-hmm. And he is someone, he's a sentient bird, so it's not just a bird flying around, who can't speak, but he's someone who seems to be a colleague of Dr. Galapagos and knows Galapagos very well, to the point that he knows what's best for Galapagos and at times berates him. But the relationship between Galapagos and Dalit, I think, is funny as well.
Yeah, this is a comic that doesn't take itself too seriously. And I think we see a lot of that in comics today. And I think, Derek, especially from the big two, we see, although we don't really discuss those very much on the podcast, but I think those are really burdened with a lot of comics and a lot of characters that take themselves so seriously. And And this one, just has a really good time with it. And again, like you said, there are a lot of humorous things. And the end of part 1, where it's a complete disaster after he's had his seizure or whatever it is, and Galapagos says, "I think it's safe to say that the diplomatic element of this mission is a failure." and it's just complete chaos. I mean, that's like the understatement of the year. And he even does a face palm later on in the comic. So there's so much fun stuff that goes on. And one of the things that I wanted to bring out too, actually in all 3 of these comics from Study Group, Soto uses a really, and we've talked a lot about webcomics and what some creators do to take advantage of the webcomics format, and others don't. But this really takes good advantage of the webcomics format in that with each of these parts, the reader is constantly scrolling down, 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 and it's basically just one long page. Each of these parts is basically one long web page, and you're scrolling, 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 and in so much of this, we see Dr. Galapagos descending through the troll kingdom, and he's going down into tunnels and down and down, and as he's going down, we are scrolling down, so that we get a sense that we are descending deeper and deeper into the depths with Dr. Galapagos, and I think that's just a really well done thing that he does.
Exactly. And in fact, I want to talk a bit about the format of not only The Secret Voice, but all of the comics on Study Group that we're discussing, and then there are others as well. If you go to, again, studygroupcomics.com, you'll see what we're talking about. The Secret Voice, Titan, but then there are other current comics as well that are like this. And Black is the Color is the exact same way. Mm-hmm. That unlike most web comics that are out there, where you have an installment and then you can either click that image that will take you to the next installment, or maybe clicking an arrow underneath that takes you to the next one, and you just click next, click next. It's, as you put it, a scrolling down. And, that in and of itself, I think, is noteworthy because, why click through when you can merely just scroll down and stay on the same page? And then what the creators do, what in this case Zack Soto does, is he includes the next installment, which is something like the next page of a comic. Not exactly. I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. Underneath the previous one, and then another one, and then another one. So, for instance, updating that particular page. So you scroll down to get the complete chapter. So I think that's significant in and of itself. But another reason why it's significant, and it gets back to something else that you had mentioned, that there seems to be a link between the way we read, the content of the narrative itself, and the way that we go through and consume this webcomic. So you're right. Early on, when Galapagos goes into this troll territory, into the tunnels, and he either goes down or sometimes even looks down, or at least Zack Soto as the narrative creator takes us down into the depths of the troll regions. We find these very long panels that descend down the page, just as we scroll down the page, and just as Galapagos descends into the troll region. So I think that makes the reading experience even more notable.
Yeah, it's very effectively done, and I was wondering too what type of reading experience it would be on as a webcomic as we have experienced it versus a print comic. And I know that I think the first 2 issues of this are out in print now.
I'm glad that you mentioned that, my friend, because I was just going to bring up the fact that I have the first 2 issues of Soto's The Secret Voice, and the layout of the comic is very different from what we see online on the web. Now, whereas, and it's difficult to describe this completely. I wish this were, in this case, a video podcast, because then I could show listeners/watchers what it is I'm trying to relate. But whereas in the webcomic you may have one panel that takes up the width of the reading space, In the book, what Soto does in several cases is to place panels side by side. In other words, arrange them on the printed page in ways that they were not arranged on the webcomic. Sometimes this works in a very effective manner to kind of bring together an entire scene. So in this first part, if you try to understand where I'm coming from, you know how Galapagos introduces us to where he is, and we get these scenes. It's almost as if we're seeing things from his point of view, and he's looking at different sections of the troll realm, the various bridges and walkways that he comments at one point. It's amazing how they stay up because they're so intricate. Well, in the comic, some of these scenes are combined together. Soto puts them together to where you have a 2-page spread. So you can see the expansiveness of the troll region underground in ways that you can't on the webcomic. But in the webcomic, you do get this sense of movement that the printed version of The Secret Voice doesn't give you in the same way. So I think each form of this narrative, the webcomic form and then the printed comic, they do different things. So I don't want to say that one does something better than the other, or it's better as a webcomic or better as a printed comic, but I think each is unique in its own way, and each brings a different reading experience.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because there are some scenes that I definitely wondered how they would come across, and the ones that you mentioned with the trolls, that's a good one. I'm looking fairly early in the first part, where one of the trolls, it looks like he's putting buckets on a rope, and they're slowly descending down, and of course on the webcomic you're just scrolling down, and those are pretty large panels on a webcomic, and I was trying to think, wow, if I read this in a regular comic, how would that be laid out? And it would seem that there would be a lot of wasted space, or either a lot of it would just have a different flow. Like you said, it would be a different reading experience.
Exactly. Now, what you're referring to now takes up, I guess, total, not quite 2 pages. There's one complete page that deals with those various scenes of the bucket on the rope descending down, but it also takes a little bit of 2 other pages, one right before and one right after it. So it doesn't reveal that in the same way. So Soto definitely doesn't waste page space. In other words, there's not a lot of negative space in the comic. Again, it's just a different presentation, another way of reading and consuming this narrative. I don't want to say whether one is better than the other, but they give you different experiences. Another thing that the printed version of at least issue 1 gives you that you don't find in part 1 of the webcomic is the voiceover, if you want to call it that, the narration from Dr. Galapagos, because, we get a little context at the very beginning. You've already referred to that, being an account of the closing days of the War of Compulsion. And so you have that background information, the exposition there. But then we get narration from Dr. Galapagos himself. And so, a mere fortnight after being released from the care of the psychic surgeons of the Red College, which I read previously, I find myself in the dank and sweltering tunnels of the cave trolls. And then we get other bits of narration that are interspersed between and among the various panels as you scroll down the page. Though I would never deny that they are a fascinating species, trollkind tend to trumpet their achievements in grandiose terms, casting themselves as master philosophers, builders, and warriors. And then we have several other instances of this narration from Galapagos until, if you scroll down a bit, this is past that rope bucket scene you referred to earlier. And this is when now Galapagos is in the chamber of Thorgmal, the Troll King. And right after he addresses in a word balloon, the first time in this comic, "So you see, Lord Thorgmal." Okay, after that, we have no more of this external narration from Galapagos. Now, none of that external communication is in the comic.
Oh, really?
Yes, which again gives it a completely different feel, because when you open the first issue of the hard copy comic, The Secret Voice, you just see a series of these panels that are almost all silent. And in fact, the only sounds that you hear are some of the trolls as they laugh and then communicate, but they're speaking in a language all their own, so you don't know what they're saying. But most of these opening panels on the first 5, 6, 7 pages are silent.
That's really interesting. So the information that is in the webcomic in that opening section before he actually speaks, that's not conveyed in any way?
No, just the panels themselves that are in the webcomic.
Because, to me, that kind of gave it a feeling. It kind of gave it sort of a Jules Verne type of feeling to it. And like some of his novels and some of the films that have been made from that, where you're getting a little bit of background information and his or whoever's observations. I guess I'm thinking mainly of Journey to the Center of the Earth. But while you're going down, you're getting some of those observations. But if you're not getting any of that in the print version, I would think this would be a little bit more confusing.
I'm not sure, because I read the webcomic first and then the printed comic. So now, after having read the webcomic, I knew the context. So when I read the printed version, issue 1 of The Secret Voice, I already knew what was going on, so I cannot go back and read it as a complete newbie. I'm not ignorant,
right.
So I'm unconsciously or consciously filling in those gaps. So I can't tell you about the reading experience. It would be curious to have someone read this first hard copy issue of The Secret Voice, not tell them anything, and just ask them after they get past the first, let's say, 7 or 8 pages, what do you think is going on? So I don't know. Yeah, and I don't know which is more successful.
Yeah, and like you said, once you've experienced in one way, it's difficult to it's impossible really to experience it again for the first time, even if the format is different.
Mm-hmm. Now, we mentioned that this webcomic so far is in 5 parts. The first 3 parts take place down in the territory of the cave trolls, underground. And then the second 2 parts take place above ground. And by the beginning of part 4, Dr. Galapagos has found his way out of the cave troll realm, and so he's back above ground, and he is picked up by his friends Dalit the bird and Peter, who drives a wagon. And it's the wagon that is both the, I guess, form of transportation and also the headquarters of Dr. Galapagos.
Yes, and we have some other new characters that emerge as well. I think one of them that has been referred to earlier, the Proctor General. We learn a little bit. We see, actually, as you mentioned, we see Peter, the guy that's driving the wagon, and the bird Dalit. But then we also see this desert city that has this crowd gathered, and it looks like there's a revolution going on with people storming the walls of a city. And there's this aristocratic guy on the tower that's kind of looking down at everything. And the mayor, apparently, of the city bursts in and says, "This is a disaster. The smog empire is at the gate, which cannot hold, and we are handily outnumbered." And this other man is, we learned, the Proctor General, who was mentioned.
Of the Red College.
Of the Red College, who was mentioned earlier. So we have another subplot going on here. So we know that that things are going to get a little bit more complex as far as the story goes, and they do. There are also 3 other guys that we meet who are actually kind of standing in the path of the wagon as it's traveling, as Dr. Galapagos is making his way on the rest of his journey. That's another really humorous section.
Yeah, these are bandits. These are road bandits.
Yeah, these guys that are basically just kind of there to take anything that these guys have. But it's a very funny exchange, and we won't go into exactly what happens. But that's the great thing about this webcomic, too, is you think you're getting this in the first 3 sections, you've got this kind of Jules Verne, Journey to the Center of the Earth, mad mayhem superhero book going on, and then it changes direction. And I think Soto does a great job of doing that, because you don't get in a rut of a certain genre. And like you mentioned too, we got a little bit of a mashup going on here. It keeps it interesting, yet it never fails to stop with the humor. The humor is always there. The action is always there. It's just kind of the location has changed a little bit.
Yeah, what did you call it right when we started? Gonzo Adventure?
Yeah, I that may have been what I said.
Something like that. And I think that's a great way of describing what goes on here. I want to say something else about hard copy versions of The Secret Voice. And I know this is a webcomic show and not one that deals specifically with hard copy comics. But these hard copies of The Secret Voice do have a basis in the webcomic. Now, with The Secret Voice, which apparently started back in 2012, I don't think this started as a webcomic, or at least the webcomic that we see here, because there was a first volume of The Secret Voice that came out around fall of 2005.
I discovered that as well.
Yeah, and in fact, I'm holding that first volume in my hand. This came out from Ad House, and the issue's called The Secret Voice, issue number 1. Half of it is devoted to the story The Secret Voice, and then the other half are various stories and the I guess some prose that Soto wrote to introduce what he's doing, what he would like this project to be, all of that. But in this first half of the book, we get a different kind of Secret Voice, and it's interesting because it's a different comic, so different panels, different drawings. Soto is not recycling in this second volume what he did in this first one that apparently, from what I gather, he decided to abandon and then start over with the webcomic. But most of what goes on in this volume 1 of Secret Voice, put out by Ad House several years ago, 10 years ago, I guess, is basically encapsulated in part 3 of the webcomic.
That's very interesting. And I read a few of the comments on this webcomic, and I know we've talked about the pros and cons of comments before, but there was one that I read, and it said apparently somebody made a comment about part 4 being in a very different direction than the first 3 parts. And Soto commented, "I appreciate the kind words. Trying something a little different with the rest of the book." So that might lead me to believe that trying something different may actually be what we see first in the webcomic. If what he actually did first was that scene that we discussed in part 4.
Yeah, I don't know. I just get the sense that when he first started the story, The Secret Voice, at least as I see in this Ad House version, he basically starts off with what we see now in the webcomic of part 3. So you're kind of thrown into the middle of things, and there's not much context. But then he went back with his webcomic and gave us a little more of a backstory, gave us some earlier interaction with Thorgmal and what ended up happening to Thorgmal, and then adds part 4 and 5, which, as we mentioned, takes place above ground. It's a complete shift of scene, but it still deals with Dr. Galapagos as the main character. So, again, it just seems to me that with the webcomic, what Zack Soto has done is to go back and really flesh out his story in a way that he didn't do when he first started this 2005 version.
Again, that's one of those interesting things. Had you read that initial publication first, your reading experience might be a little bit different than someone who had read the webcomic first.
Exactly.
But, regardless, I think, not having read the printed versions, I think it would probably work well either way.
Yeah. And, as I said earlier, when it comes to the web version or the hard copy version, each has their benefits. Each is read in a very different way. It's a different reading experience. So whether you prefer one or the other, or even both. I mean, I think if you really like The Secret Voice, and for my money, why wouldn't you, right? I think if this is a great comic, then I think it would be well worth it to get a hard copy version of it, or at least the first 2 issues, and those are available at the website. So if you do go to studygroupcomics.com, you will see links of where you can buy their hard copy versions of some of their webcomics.
And we should also point out too that Zack Soto has on each page a Patreon ad that you can get Patreon exclusive content if you want to support him in this project, and it's a really interesting project.
Yeah, and I think
I like it a lot.
Yeah, and also I think if you're a Patreon supporter, you may get a discount on the hard copy comics that you get through Study Group Comics.
Yeah, so that definitely would be worth supporting him on.
Mm-hmm. So you want to go to the next current ongoing title that we're looking at from Study Group Comics?
Let's do that.
Okay, this is François Vigneault's Titan, and I guess I'm pronouncing the last name correct. It's Vigneault, so Vigneault. Vigneault.
That sounds good to me.
Okay, so Titan, it seems like it started as a webcomic about the same time as The Secret Voice, around March of 2012, or at least early in 2012. At least the first part was finished at that time. But this is not as developed as The Secret Voice. So far, Titan is in 4 parts, and the 4th part seems to be currently being updated. In fact, the last time it was updated, when I checked today, was July 16th, so that was just a few days ago.
Yeah, and like you said, Derek, we don't have as much comic here, but in some ways we have a much denser narrative than what we have in The Secret Voice. Completely different type of comic. This one, for listeners that have not checked it out, is about a man named Da Silva who is sent to a place called the Homestead Station on the moon of Titan. And he's being sent there to do a couple of things too. First, there are tensions between the genetically engineered Titan workers who are indigenous to that moon and the Terran management, the people that are managing the station from Earth. They do not get along. He is there also to increase productivity, which has not been going very well. So that's how the story opens, is we see this guy Da Silva trying to not only get production back up, but to restore or maybe not even restore, maybe there never was a amicable relationship in the first place.
Right. And where he goes on Titan, it's a place called Homestead Station, and this is a refinery. What they do is they process hydrocarbons.
Right.
And apparently the output has not been what the Terrans, those back on Earth, expected should be. And so Da Silva goes there to see what the problem is, how, they can increase production, or perhaps, if they can't, shut down the operation entirely.
Yeah, and again, tensions are very, very high there. And Da Silva gets there and recognizes that things are not going to be as easy as he thought they were going to be. He meets a couple of the Titans, and the Titans are several heads taller than the humans. I mean, they're really, really big.
They're big and they're dense, and something that becomes an issue not just later on, but early on, is they're more or less limited to places like Titan. They definitely can't go back to Earth because the mass of their body, the way that they're bred, the way that they're built, the way that they're, I guess, genetically engineered, would cause their death in the gravity of the Earth.
Right. Yeah. So there are only certain atmospheres that they can live on, Titan being one of them. When Da Silva first gets there, he meets 2 Titans. One is named Cyrus, who is the head of the labor union, and a deputy named Macintosh, who we get to know by her first name as Phoebe. And the Titans the laborers greatly outnumber the Earth people. It's about 1,000 Earth people to 250,000 Titan labor force. So they definitely have the upper hand as far as the number of people there. But that labor that they have is essential to the economy to get things production going back up. And again, things have slipped severely. De Silva is there to increase productivity. And one of the most interesting things to me, Derek, was this relationship between De Silva and Phoebe. De Silva seems to have, and still it's early on in the story, he seems to have maybe romantic inclinations towards Phoebe, who, again, is several heads taller than her, and you wonder how they could have any kind of physical relationship at all. I guess anything's possible. But
yeah, that's what I'm waiting to see.
Yeah. But she is kind of the person that we feel is going to help him through this situation, and things get pretty ugly pretty early.
Oh, exactly.
So we find out that this is going to be this is certainly not going to be a crazy fun fest like The Secret Voice is. This is going to be there's so many things going on here. It's science fiction, clearly, because we have that element. It's possibly a romance. It's possibly or it's definitely a social commentary. There are a lot of things going on here, and probably the most frustrating thing about the comic is I wish we just had more of it.
Yeah, I agree. And, I think you've hinted at this along the way, but we haven't come right out and said this. But this is not only a much more serious comic, but it's also one that's much more socially and politically charged than Secret Voice. The relationship between the Terrans and the Titans is in many ways an example of class warfare. It also could be read as an example of ethnic strife, because the way that the Titans are, or at least what we see in the comic, the way that the Titans are viewed by the Terrans is as kind of a second-class citizen, that they aren't as good as the Terrans, and so they shouldn't even be treated like full humans because they're really not human. So there's, I think, a lot of political charge that's packed into Titan.
Yeah, there definitely is, and I really look forward to seeing that part, really all parts of this webcomic explored as it develops. That is definitely one of the most interesting aspects of it, is the political class warfare that's going on here. And anytime that you've got a story like this that has a little bit of complexity to it, you want to see those things explored, and you want to see the relationships explored too. And it looks like that Titan is going to do a really, really good job of doing that, just based on the few parts that we have so far.
Exactly. Now, as we mentioned, so far this comic is in 3 completed parts, and the 4th part is currently being updated. Again, it was last updated just a few days ago, this July. But, there is one hard copy issue of Titan that is out, and I did get my hands on that as well. And the hard copy issue 1 of Titan basically includes both parts 1 and 2. It ends when part 2 ends.
Oh, okay.
And visually, or at least in terms of the way that the panels are arranged, it's different from The Secret Voice. I mentioned that in Secret Voice, Soto lays out the panels in a much different manner in the hard copy than he does from the webcomic. Well, in Titan, everything's laid out about the same. And in fact, the only big difference, or the only noticeable difference between the webcomic version of Titan and the hard copy, is that in part 2 of the webcomic Titan, the tone, the color is blue, whereas in part 1 the color is orangish.
Yeah, kind of rust color.
Yeah. Now in the comic, it's all that kind of orangish rust color, including what comprises part 2. So the second half of this first hard copy issue is not in light blue.
Okay.
But that's the only difference that I can discern.
You know, one of the things that kind of jumped out at me as we've been looking at this is, and you don't get this with The Secret Voice, but when you're looking through the webcomic of Titan, you can kind of look through and see that there's a definite panel arrangement, and there seems to be a definite page break, and you look at it and you think, okay, that could be a page. And you scroll down and you think, okay, that could be a page.
And they're consistent in size.
And they are, yes, they're very consistent. So I can see how this would probably lay out in a more consistent manner on the page than maybe The Secret Voice.
Exactly. This translates much more in a one-to-one way than The Secret Voice does. Mm-hmm. Going from webcomic to hard copy.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I really like this story. And, you know, as we mentioned, it's quite a bit more serious, and so you don't have the kind of freewheeling, humorous side that we found in The Secret Voice. And there's a lot to come here. I mean, of course, there's a lot to come with The Secret Voice, but I get the same feeling with Titan, because you expect there's going to be some kind of relationship building between De Silva and Phoebe, that the tensions between the Titans and the Terrans seem to be slowly building. And then what we find in part 4, and again, this is still being updated now, but there's an additional complication when it comes to another one of the Terran managers currently residing on Titan, and that is a manager by the name of Cheng. And in fact, when De Silva in part 1 first gets off of his spaceship and lands on Titan, he's expecting manager Cheng to greet him, but it's another manager by the name of Jones. Joans, and he informs De Silva that manager Cheng, is not feeling well, so she can't meet him. But it's not until part 4 that we find out that something is physically wrong with manager Cheng.
Yeah, and again, right now, as far as the updates go, that's one of those places where I can't wait to see what the next part is going to be.
Right, because this is an extra complication, another wrinkle.
Right. Yeah, definitely is going to be that. Yeah. I was going to say one of the things that I really, really like about this is, we've mentioned a little bit about the romantic angle, or the possible romantic angle that is in the comic between De Silva and Phoebe. I one of the things that's so well done, and I think this has got to be really hard to do if you're any kind of creator that's writing or making a film, anything that even has the potential of a romantic element, is to do that in such a way that it's not in your face, it's not obvious. One of the things that is done here that I really, really like, in the very opening, we get De Silva, and we see that he's on his ship, or he's being taken to Homestead Station, and he's listening to something on his device that's kind of like a headset or an iPod or whatever. He's listening to a song by Wilco called Far, Far Away.
And that's a great song, too.
And it is a great song, too. So that was nice to see that. And at the end, and this is not really a spoiler, at the end of part 3, we see Phoebe, and she is listening to something also, but it's very interesting that she is listening to a vinyl record. I mean, here's somebody on the Titan who's listening, not using the latest technology, but was actually listening to a record, and she's listening to Chuck Berry's Johnny Be Good. Mm-hmm. And I think that just shows the differences between the two, and that huge gap in technology and maybe even funding for them to be able to purchase the entertainment, but yet it shows a relationship.
Exactly.
A connection that they have. So I just really thought that was very well done, very tastefully done, and something that's pretty rare in any type of story like this.
Right. And, on the topic of Phoebe, I'm glad that you brought her up again. When we were discussing The Secret Voice a moment ago, I think both of us unambiguously considered Dr. Galapagos the protagonist. Mm-hmm. There are other characters in that narrative so far, but up until part 5, he's the mover and shaker, unquestionably. With Titan, I think you'd be tempted to see Joio, and that's his first name, Joio da Silva, as the protagonist. But as you get into parts 3 and then 4, or especially 3, I guess, you start wondering, at least I started to wonder, if maybe Phoebe McIntosh, the Titan, might possibly become just as prominent a character as Da Silva, because we start to learn more about her, not only in terms of her musical taste, as you mentioned at the end of part 3, but also in the way that she manipulates things. She goes at one point, this is at the very beginning, or this is, I guess, in part 2, she goes to Da Silva's chambers and wants to talk to him about how he could help her if she helps him. She says that, I think I know what you want to do here. I can help you with the Titans. The Titans don't like you. They like me because I'm one of them. Let me help you. But you've got to do something for me in return. And she asks him, you got to get me off Titan and onto Luna. And I'm assuming she means Earth's moon. Because, she could stand the gravity there, or at least it wouldn't kill her, and it's a much better job than what she has working in the mines or working at the refinery on Titan. So she wants to get something out of this. We see her a little manipulative side, I think, but we also see a little bit about her history. She is someone who used to be one of the fighters, because apparently, as we find in part 3, that the Titans for entertainment have matches, fighting matches, where they pit one Titan against another. And she used to be the biggest fighter. She was the one who would win all the time. But she doesn't fight anymore. Mm-hmm. And even though Cirrus, who is the head of the Titan Union, as you mentioned, apparently he oversees the fight, and he says to her at one point that she should come back and fight again. Let me know if you want to come back. And she says, I never will. So again, that adds a complication of character in terms of, who is this person? Who is this Titan, Phoebe McIntosh? So she's definitely a complex three-dimensional character. And we're seeing about as much of her as we are at Da Silva by the time we get into part 4.
And I really like that. I like that balance of character, and we don't really know, like you said, whose story this is. Maybe it's both of their stories. Maybe we're just getting some background on both of them. But I think it's fascinating that we have both of them being explored so fully. And I'm glad you mentioned that scene where Phoebe meets some of her friends they call it a mixer match. Mm-hmm. And it's really just a fight. It's like boxing. And like you said, Phoebe was a mixer, but she quit. And there's a great line in there where she said, I don't like hurting people, and I'm too good at it. And wow, that just reveals so much about her character and about the conflict within her. And again, like the relationship that she's got with Da Silva, this is handled so well, and it's not heavy-handed at all. The way that Vigneault handles his characters is very, very, very unique and very, I don't want to say intricate, but well thought out.
Right. Yeah, this is definitely another webcomic from Study Group Comics that I will be keeping up with.
Yeah, me too.
So, Andy, you want to get to the last title that we're going to be discussing today?
Yes, let's do that.
And that is our already completed comic of the month. This is called Black is the Color. This is written by Julia Gfrörer, and I guess that's how you pronounce this name. It's spelled Gfrörer. And I read that it rhymes with or sounds a little bit like despair. So that would be Julia Gfrörer if you don't pronounce the harder, even the softer G.
So if we have butchered your name, Julia, we certainly apologize.
Oh, it'd be great if she's listening.
It would be great. Yeah, we would love to hear what you think.
Yeah, Julia, if you listen to this, get in touch with us and let us know that you listened.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and this is something that actually, I knew about this before I discovered The Secret Voice and Titan, but I didn't know it as a webcomic.
I didn't either. And Derek, didn't this come out from Fantagraphics in print?
Yes, I believe it was published in December of 2013 as a kind of a small book. It's not very long, and I'm looking at it now. I happened to get a copy because I read it when it originally came out. And it's a relatively quick read. Oh, first printing October of 2013, not December, October of 2013. So it's been not quite 2 years since this came out, but it was a webcomic first, and I think that the webcomic was completed late 2012 from what I can tell on the website. But when you and I started to dig around into Study Group Comics, I discovered that, hey, Black is the Color was also a Study Group comic.
Yeah, so, and there's the little publisher spotlight that we have.
Yeah. In fact, it definitely is worth taking a look not only at the titles that we're highlighting in the webcomic show this month, but just going to Study Group and you click on their contributor list and there are many, many, many people. And I don't know if all of them, but it seems like many of these creators start their projects as webcomics, and then many go on to publish them in hard copy form.
Yeah, so, I mean, like you said, the list of contributors is just incredible. I mean, you got names like Dash Shaw, you've got Farrell Dalrymple,
Box Brown.
Box Brown, and there's so many. Michael DeForge. I mean, it just goes on and on. Renee French, Sam Alden. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it is. So definitely worth checking out as a website. But in particular, getting back to Black is the Color, this is another one of those webcomics, like the other ones that we've discussed today, that you scroll down in order to get the story. So you don't click panel, or installment. Just click through. You scroll down. And also, like the other ones, there are reader comments at the end. And you know, these reader comments, you've mentioned them before, but we haven't gone into a lot of detail. They're definitely not obtrusive.
Right.
Because they come at the very end, so it's the very bottom of the page. So unlike a lot of webcomics, you're not confronted by reader responses with each installment or each click of the webcomic that you're going through.
Exactly. Yeah, and that is nice because the comments can become a distraction if you're constantly clicking page after page and making a conscious decision. Do I want to read these comments? I like the way they have it so that they're not until the very end, as you said, and if you don't want to read them, you don't have to.
Right. Now, you know, compared to both The Secret Voice and Titan, Gfrörer's Black is the Color is a relatively short and straightforward narrative. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot that goes on, but I think within the limited event range, if we want to call it that, of this comic, it's really packed tight with a lot of visuals.
It really is packed tight with a lot of visuals and a lot of as you said, for it to be as somewhat limited as it is, there's a pretty broad range of things that are going on, and that there's so much of this is what I would call minimalistic, that we have several panels in a row where not a lot of change seems to happen, and I think that works well to the nature of the story, the content of the story, the structure of the story. You know, we're getting ahead of ourselves. I think I'm getting ahead of myself because we really haven't talked about what the webcomic is about.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about the content. Again, it's a relatively simple and straightforward story. It starts off on a ship, an old ship out at sea, and there are two characters. One of them is Warren, and the other one is Xavier. Now, Xavier, we can tell from the very beginning, is not in best of health, but the ship has been suffering some setbacks to where they're about to run out of supplies, and in order for the entire ship and its crew to survive, they have to, I guess, so to speak, let a couple of them go. And so I guess I don't know if it's the captain or the captain's lackey or someone who tells them at the very beginning that we're going to have to set you adrift
Yeah,
Warren.
I think it's the lackey because he mentions the captain.
Okay, it's that. And so he says, we're going to have to set you adrift. And so Warren and Xavier are put on a small boat and drift out to sea because Xavier's not in the best of health. He dies fairly early on. That's no spoiler. Yeah. But then Warren is by himself, and at one point he even wonders if he is hallucinating because he sees a mermaid. And then through the rest of the story, for the most part, it is Warren's relationship with one particular mermaid, and her name is Eulalia. I guess that's how you pronounce her name, Eulalia, Eulalia.
That's better than what I had. I was thinking Eulalia or something like that. So I like your pronunciation much better.
Yeah, and so there are a couple of times when Eulalia visits Warren in the boat and is there with him, usually at night. And that's, in essence, the gist of Black is the Color. You know, two guys set out to drift. One guy dies. The other guy experiences a relationship of some way with a mermaid by the name of Eulalia.
And it's really interesting. Some of this, the way that these relationships begin are almost like kind of matter of fact in the way that they proceed. Like Eulalia comes to him, and she's initially comforting him, and she says, "I've got you," which she also says later in the comic with a very different meaning. And she seems to be very comforting, but at the same time, she says things like, "Your wife has already forgotten about you." So there's this kind of a dual thing going on. You know, is she a comforter? Is she there to help him? Is she there to hurt him? There's this duality that's going on. But as you said, Derek, the story itself is very, very simple. What makes this such a memorable webcomic is the way that things change and the way that they move so slowly in some ways. And again, the format is used to very, very good effect because we are, without giving too much away, we are constantly scrolling down, and there's also a sense that we are constantly going into the depths of the sea. There are several scenes with Eulalia and other mermaids, and part of the allure to this is we are constantly being drawn further and further and deeper into the water, into the depths as we are scrolling down.
Exactly. Now, you mentioned earlier that there's kind of a slow or at least steady or leisurely pacing in this comic, and that has everything to do with the content because there are long sections when Warren is drifting alone by himself, forlorn, or he's drifting in his boat being comforted by Eulalia, and I think those slower, more leisurely paced scenes where you would have multiple panels of what at first looks like the same illustration. I mean, there's subtle differences. It's not just the same image represented over and over and over again. But what that tends to do is to stretch out the scene, and that underscores the long period of time that Warren is out there by himself.
Yes, and that's very effectively done. If you saw the same thing in a film, you have the element of time actually working with it as well, and this can take time. I mean, you should read this webcomic not quickly, but should allow those panels to kind of accumulate so that you do get the impression of passage of time. Much of this stuff does move by slowly and is very minimalistic and has very minute changes, but there are some very significant panels which we won't go into where things change quickly, and when that happens it's very jarring and very effective.
Oh, exactly. So well, yeah, I don't want to go into detail of some of these dramatic images, but some of these dramatic events don't even include Warren and Eulalia, but other mermaids. Mm-hmm. And in fact, there's one point in this story where we're taken away from whatever's going on with Warren, mermaid or otherwise, and we're back at his ship that basically set him adrift. And there's someone, one of the sailors is using the knife that Warren gave him. Right before Warren leaves the ship, he gives to one of his fellow sailors a knife. And so this is not quite halfway through the comic. We see this sailor back on the ship, and he's cutting rope with the knife. And so this, again, not the captain, but the lackey, the guy who told Warren and Xavier that they had to go, asks him what that was. He says, "What's that?" And the sailor says, "What, this? I don't know. I found it," which is weird because that is what, at least I think, Warren gave to him. Maybe he gave it to someone else and someone else has it. And so this guy looks at it and says, "Pretty," the knife, and then he sticks it into the mast that they're standing next to. And he says, "Come on down and eat now." And so then we're presented with this final scene. There are two panels of this knife stuck in the mast.
Yeah, I really like that scene, and one of the things I really like about it is because that character, like you said, that character was given that knife by Warren, and that scene is almost a denial of the relationship that those two guys had. And it's very interesting later on where Eulalia is talking with Warren about his former loves, and Warren talks about being a sailor on the ship, and sometimes it's inevitable, I guess, as a sailor that you might have thoughts of another man. And we find out that Warren is probably lying to her about the extent of the relationship that he's had with this other sailor. And we wonder if it could be this guy that you mentioned that has the knife. But one of the really, really interesting things about this is, much of this does seem to be about relationships and the denial of them, or not being completely honest. And we're not exactly sure what the mermaid's motivation is, if they're being completely honest with the people that they interact with. But one of my favorite scenes is when Warren and Eulalia are having this conversation, and they're clinging to each other, they're embracing each other, and what's really interesting is what their hands are doing. Their hands are clasped together, but their fingers, the pressure and the position, they're changing constantly as the conversation goes on, and they're revealing and not revealing things about themselves.
You're right. A couple things of what you've just said I want to get to. One, I want to go back to the fellow sailor of Warren's, and I went to the beginning of the story. His name is Zevulun, called Zev for short. And there does seem to be some kind of friendship because early on he does give him the knife. He says, "I want you to have this," and Zev goes, "Huh?" Warren says, "Please just take it, Zev. I can't use it anymore. Zev, I hope you know that I," and then that's where that ends. And then Zev says, "Shut up, Warren. Just shut the fuck up right now." Okay? So that gets back to something that you said, the unspoken relationship, or something that could be there but we don't know. Now, along with this, and this is not in the webcomic, but in the book that was published almost 2 years ago from Fantagraphics, the last page of the book, and this is the author bio, it's a short author bio, the only image on that page is the knife on a chain.
Oh, well, that gives it a whole different meaning.
Mm-hmm. So I think it lends more credence to your reading that there was something between Zev and Warren that we didn't know, because Warren does tell the mermaid, Eulalia, that when he did have this homosexual encounter, or at least potential one, it was when he was younger. He said he was a boy, one of his first times out to sea. So maybe he was not revealing everything to her accurately. Now, the other thing I wanted to point out is you mentioned that Eulalia may not be the comforting angel she initially appears to be. And I don't know if I'm reading too much into this, but there are several places in this comic when she opens her mouth, you see that her teeth are sharp.
Yes.
Now,
yes.
Part of me wonders that, if you see sharp teeth, usually that suggests that there's something evil going on. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. I mean, hell, for all we know, mermaids have sharp teeth like that.
Right.
But she does look, and other mermaids do look a little different when they open their mouth and you do see the sharp teeth. They look a little more menacing. And so I'm wondering if is she an angel of life, or might she be more an angel of death?
Right. And one of the things that's so fascinating about Eulalia and the other mermaids is they have this to me, it was a really unexpected, I guess you might even call it a subplot. It's really not a subplot, but they're actually in the water, and they see this ship approaching, and they're talking to each other, and they're talking about, I wish I could go back and record these songs. And that really, really seems like it's completely out of the story. But and we don't really know what they mean by recording. I mean, we don't know if they mean, the recording in the way that we think of recording, or if there's a whole different element of it. But it gives their characters a very unexpected turn, and again, we get a lot of depth of character. We don't really know a lot about these mermaids, but now we know a little bit more, even if it's something that we can't completely grasp.
Exactly. In fact, I think one place that you're referring to, this takes place almost in the exact middle of the narrative, and we have a group of mermaids, and they're watching this ship, and of course a bad storm has come up, and the ship is being tossed hither and thither. Lightning is striking, and so they're watching it. But at the same time that they're watching this, almost as if they're watching a movie, they're having conversations about the mundane parts of their life. You mentioned something about recording, but they're also talking about meeting mermen, I guess, or relationships, someone doing something, or someone reporting that they did something the other day, or they're about to do something. Again, mundane conversation topics as they're watching this ship from a distance being tossed around and endangered by the storm.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then after this, we're taken back to Eulalia and Warren and about their relationship. And then there's one part of this story that it at least appears to me, this is toward the end, when we're back on dry land, supposedly, and Warren returns to his home, and his wife answers the door. He hugs her, and they go to bed. They kiss, then they go to bed. And then she, as she's kissing him, she makes the comment, "You taste like seawater." And so they're intimate, and then apparently he gets up and goes away, or at least he's no longer there in bed with her. Then we're taken back out to sea with Warren in the boat, being comforted perhaps by Eulalia, and then she takes him out of the boat and down into the depths. So what is it that we just experienced on land? Was it only inside of his head? I mean, that's what I assumed it to be. But then again, maybe almost everything that goes on in this comic is a fantasy or some kind of delusion, because this is a guy who's set adrift. He's out there under the elements with apparently no food. So maybe he's hallucinating most of this.
Yeah, and I was wondering the same thing. I thought, is this an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge type of story?
Yeah, I didn't thought of that, but that's a great reference.
And if it is, it's fine, and if it's not, it's fine. I'm fine with it either way. But the thing about this story is it's got so much richness to it. Even though, like we mentioned earlier, it seems like not a lot happens, but there's a tremendous amount of humanity to this story, because even if a lot doesn't happen, the questions that it asks and doesn't necessarily answer are pretty amazing. And what's going on with character that Ferrer is doing is just really tremendous. One of the things too, Derek, we haven't really talked about is the art style of this book or this webcomic. I didn't know what your impressions of it were.
I love the art style. It comes across as very sketchy, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but a lot of the finished illustration has a kind of a loose, almost sketch feel to it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's especially the case in the webcomic itself. And I don't want to keep comparing these webcomics to the printed versions, but at least in the first part of the Fantagraphics book that came out not quite 2 years ago, there is a very noticeable difference in the opening pages when Warren and Xavier are still on the boat. The panels have more background and there's much more detail. Now, this difference becomes less striking as you get into the last half of the book and compare it to the webcomic. So it's a little, I guess, less minimalist in terms of the art style and quite a bit more detailed and complex in the book version. So I guess that Gfrörer went and used the Fantagraphics version to really flesh out some of the visuals in ways that she didn't in the original webcomic.
I definitely want to pick up the print version as well to see those differences, because I really, really like this art style, and for listeners who might want to check out both, the webcomic is just pure black and white, very fine lines, and shadings are not done through like gray colors or anything like that, but shadings are rendered through basically adding more lines.
Right, hatching.
Or hatching,
Making
those crisscross patterns. Rick Geary does a great job of doing that, but this, I think, is a little bit more finely, not that Geary's work is not finely detailed, but a little bit more hatching going on.
Right.
It's beautiful work.
It is. And, I mentioned the Fantagraphics book, but apparently this appeared as a 2-issue mini-comic if you look at toward the bottom of the website of Black is the Color, because it says Black is the Color mini-comic collections, and then there's 1 and then 2, but both of those are sold out. So if you wanted to get hard copies, you have to get the Fantagraphics version, which is great. So there's that. I want to get back to something, though, that you said a moment ago before you referenced the art. You said that this is a story that is not as clear-cut as, let's say, Titan or The Secret Voice. And I think that's one of the things I really love about Black is the Color. It's a much more open and especially ambiguous narrative. And at times we're not exactly sure how to read it. So, an example of that would be a question that we asked earlier. How much of this is actually happening to Warren, and how much of this is some kind of fantasy that he's having? Is it just going on in his head or not? And I love that kind of ambiguity. It even ends in a very ambiguous way. Once Eulalia takes Warren down into the water, what happens? Well, something happens, and I think that the way that Gfrörer represents this is really stunning, getting back to the art, but it's ambiguous.
It is, and that, well, first of all, that reminds me there's a question I want to ask you when we're off of the show that would definitely be a spoiler. But yeah, the other thing about that is, there's a lot of times where I really, really enjoy some ambiguity in my fiction, my graphic novels, films, and I think this does. Ambiguity can either be polarizing or not. And I know with a lot of people that I talk to about certain films or books that I like that do have that element of ambiguity, they will read those books or watch those movies and say, it was just too much for me. I need something definite. I need a definite conclusion. I don't always need that, and it's really hard to pull off without being frustrating. But I think that this is a really, really great example that Gfrörer has done of giving us a story that has some of that ambiguity, but yet is so satisfying because she does everything so well.
Mm-hmm. Now, part of that ambiguity gets back to the title, and I wanted to ask you, what do you think black means?
Well, and again, we could get into spoiler territory here, but there's a certain element of blackness that appears and reappears throughout the webcomic. That is what I kept thinking of, and Derek, you know what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. That was what reminded me of the title every time that came up. But I don't know if I have that correct or if there is a correct answer.
Yeah, well, when Warren first begins seeing and then talking with Eulalia, it's at night, and the way that Gfrörer represents this is, outside of maybe stars in the background, very, very black. And then there are other moments where there are black parts of the narrative. For instance, at one point, Warren coughs and he looks at his hand and it's black. It's almost like he's coughed up something. Another time, fairly early on, he's in the boat and he looks down at his feet and there looks like it's a black patch of something, and we don't know exactly what that is. And then black appears at other moments in the narrative associated with Warren and his dilemma. So, I mean, I have a sense of what it might mean. You know, it could represent death. We don't know, but it's never really spelled out. But that kind of ambiguity, especially visualized in this way, I love.
I do too. And you know, as I'm going through it, I see some other things that make me question, is this what she was after? Is this what she was after? Was she after both of these things? Was she after all of these things? And again, that ambiguity, I celebrate that.
Mm-hmm. I really like this book.
I liked it too. This is definitely something I want to pick up in hard copy, and you know, but continue to enjoy the webcomics edition as well.
Yeah, now this one is not as easy to find off of the main website of Study Group Comics, because if you go to studygroupcomics.com and click on their webcomics, you won't find this one in the list because it's already completed, you know, over 2 years ago. But if you go to the creators and look up Julia Ferrer, starts with a G, Gfrörer, then you can get to it that way.
Derek, do you recall if this was nominated for any major awards, Eisner or anything?
I do not know.
Ignatz Award, maybe?
Not that I'm aware of, but then again, maybe I heard it and then forgot.
And you know, maybe I'm actually hoping that she will be at SPX.
Oh, that'd be great.
And we could maybe meet her and get
talk with her briefly for the show.
Yeah,
that'd be great.
Sure.
Yeah. So maybe all these guys will be there. Now, we started off the show by discussing Zack Soto's The Secret Voice, which is appropriate because Zack Soto is basically the power behind Study Group Comics. Then after that, we looked at François Vigneault's Titan, and then we concluded with Julia Ferrer's Black is the Color. So all of these are Study Group Comics. Again, studygroupcomics.com. You know, Andy, before we go, you mentioned something about Black is the Color. Did it win some kind of award or not? You know, this being a webcomic show, we would be remiss if we didn't make at least a parting comment about the digital or webcomic category of the recently announced Eisner Awards 2015. You know, that went to The Private Eye, which is an outstanding digital comic, although it's something we would not talk about on this series because it's not a webcomic technically.
Right.
It's a digital comic. But something that did win that is a webcomic is Emily Carroll's Where Darkness Presses. Now, we started our very first episode of the webcomic series with an Emily Carroll narrative. Not that one, but I was aware, in fact, I had even read When Darkness Presses when I was preparing for our discussion of that Emily Carroll on that first episode. So, yeah, that one for Best Short Story. Now, not Best Short Story in digital or webcomic form, just Best Short Story, period.
Right. Just Best Short Story.
Yeah, and, you know, it really is a phenomenal short story.
Yeah, it really is. And, you know, very, very deserving of all the attention that it gets.
Yep. So if you want to find out more about the kind of things that we're reading, digital and otherwise, then you can go to the website of our sponsor. Our sponsor is Discount Comic Book Service. So go to dcbservice.com, or you can go to their digital comic sister company, and that is mydigitalcomics.com. Whether you get your comics digitally or in hard copy, through mydigitalcomics.com or dcbservice.com. You're going to find great deals. You can't go wrong there. And after you do get your comics at those places, get in touch with us and let us know the kind of things you're going to be reading. You can get in touch with us by going to the website, comicsalternative.com, and on the right-hand side of your browser, you'll find a tab that says Send a Voicemail. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can leave us a voice message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's very simple and easy to use. Or you can contact us the old-fashioned way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And the best way to keep up with everything that we have going on the podcast and the blog is to follow us on Twitter. And we are at the number 2 guys with PhDs. And we certainly appreciate everybody that retweets the tweets that we put up.
That's right. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can contact me directly at Derek@comicsalternative.com. And Andy, how can they get in touch with you?
You can reach me at Wolverton@comicsalternative.com.
You can also find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, and on Google+. Hey, we even have a YouTube channel, so if you consume your media through YouTube, you can listen to the Comics Alternative that way. You can subscribe to our podcast through iTunes, and when you do, please leave us a rating and review. You can also stream us on Stitcher, and you can find us on TuneIn, and you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and our comics-related commentary that we put up on the blog, and that's on the website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. So we hope at least one or more of those ways of reaching us are going to be ways that you would like to take advantage of.
Well, Andy, I want to thank you very much for helping to get the ball rolling with the webcomic series. You've been with us since December, and even though we're losing you to the webcomic series, you're going to be back for not only fill-in episodes of the regular show, but for something else that is on the horizon that we'll tell listeners about in the future.
Yeah, well, thank you, Derek, and thanks for letting me be a part of this. This was very exciting because, again, this was kind of uncharted territory for me, and webcomics are going to be something that I want to continue to explore. But I'm really looking forward to you guys exploring this, and looking forward to the future podcasts you guys will have.
Yeah, well, it's been an adventure for me, and you were a great journeying partner.
Well, thank you.
Yep. So we will talk with you guys later. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy.
We'll see you later.
This has been a Filmways presentation, darling.